Well, thank you. What a warm welcome from Reverend Sue and Kevin and, boy, the musicians. And I feel right at home because, like you, I really love Laura Berman. So we have a tradition in Jewish culture where we learn with questions. So I'm going to offer 4 questions for us to engage together this morning. The first is, how do you image the divine? Small question, right? The second is how does our biblical tradition image God? The third question is, how come we left the Garden of Eden? And the fourth one, how do we get back? Right? So just take a moment and think, how do I image God? I work with a lot of 12 and 13-year-olds getting ready for bar and bat mitzvah. And sometimes I get one that says, you know what, though, Rabbi, I don't believe in God. And I say, well, describe for me the God you don't believe in. And they start talking about, a heavenly parent or grandparent or great-grandparent, mostly male, mostly judgmental, and mostly powerful. And I say, I don't believe in that God either. And they're like, oh. But wait a minute, you're a rabbi. So one of the things the Jewish tradition, the biblical tradition has given the world is this image of the divine, this idea, let me put it that way, the idea of divinity as everything, that it's all God, that there's only one, or that it's all one, which is another way of saying it's not anything we can imagine. Something intangible to be made real needs a garment, needs a cloak, needs a veil, needs an image so that we can experience it. So the Bible is filled with images of the divine. And unfortunately, some points, junctures in history, due to various historical factors, the ones that became predominant were hierarchical, patriarchal, and judgmental. God is judge, God is father, God is parent. I'm here to tell you that is the minority. In fact, I challenge you to find an image of God in the Hebrew Bible that fits that picture. By far the most predominant images of God in the Torah, in the Bible, especially in the Psalms, are natural images. God as water. God as, since we're here, boulder. And, since I live in Evergreen, God as tree. You will find far more references to the divine, accessing the divine through those images in the Bible than the picture, an anthropomorphic picture. Yes, in the Torah and the Bible, God speaks. All that is sound. How do you understand and experience sound without the image of speech? It's a metaphor. So, first 2 questions. How do you image the divine, and how does the Bible image the divine? Probably not how you thought. Right? So, I want to pull up an image of God. Today I want to talk about imaging the divine through the tree. So this coming Friday, I'll be joining you again, God willing, to celebrate 2 holidays. The Sabbath comes around every week, and a holiday called Tu B'Shvat. Try it, say it, Tu B'Shvat. 2 is really great. It's a Hebrew combination of letters that actually represents numbers, and even though it sounds like 2, it means 15. And on the 15th of the month of Shvat, That's the name of the lunar month, and the Jewish calendar goes by the moons as well as the solar calendar. So on the 15th of the month of Shvat, since it's a lunar calendar, it's the full moon. The 15th of every single month is a full moon. And most holidays start on the full moon in the Jewish calendar. And so we have a holiday. We have 4 New Years in the Jewish calendar. We have a new year for human beings, and that's called Rosh Hashanah. That's in the fall. We have a new year for the months, the moons, the lunar cycle, which is at the beginning of spring. And that's the first commandment given to the Israelites, the Hebrews, as before they leave Egypt, is make yourself a calendar and make this the first month, the month of spring. Makes a lot of sense, actually, to begin a new year when especially in the northern hemisphere, things are getting green again and coming back to life. We have a new year for animals, for domesticated animals, and we have a new year for trees. A holiday for trees. Okay, goes back 2,000 years. Jewish Arbor Day, Tu B'Shvat. So I'll be celebrating that with you, God willing, on Friday, and we'll have a Shabbat Seder, celebrate the coming of Shabbat, and honoring the trees. So this is like a tease, a prelude to that. What are we celebrating? By the way, Reverend Sue didn't tell me when to stop, so you'll have to let maybe she hasn't heard the reputation of rabbis that they can go on and on and on. Right. So Tu B'Shvat. So you see, this is a holiday, a Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanot. And how do we honor the trees? So Sue mentioned I have a favorite tree. It changes. When I was young, it was the ginkgo tree. But when I moved out to Colorado, I encountered the bristlecone pine. The bristlecone pine. Who's gone up to now Mount Blue Sky, thankfully renamed Mount Blue Sky up by Evergreen? Everybody gone through the bristlecone pine forest? If you have not yet, it is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, living organism on the planet. The bristlecone pine, and it's in your backyard. So did you get the image? Did it go up there? There you go. There's an image of a bristlecone pine that Laura and I went up to see this fall. Again, up on Mount Blue Sky. And, this one looks like it's nice and isolated, but the next picture shows that it's not so isolated. So these are the trees that live at the tree line, where nothing else lives. There are no other trees, right? This is the last line of trees. That's what they call it, the tree line, before you get just basically rocks, right? And at this extreme climate, you have a tree that is older than Christianity, right? They cut down, there's a scientist who said he would try to pick one of the trees and see how old it really was, and it was more than 2,300 years old. 2,300 years old. Oldest organism we found on the planet, living organism. Of course, that one's not living anymore. And that scientist is feeling that regret every day. So imagine if you're going to try to perceive and experience and become an expression of divinity, the image you choose makes a difference. Another favorite tree is the aspen tree, which is really a weed, right? And the aspen tree is remarkable because it was considered for a long time the largest organism on the planet, because it's one root system of an entire orchard, right, of an entire grove, is one organism. It's not individual trees. Now that seems to me a very apropos image of the divine. Mm-hmm. It looks like we're, 100 whatever people here, individuals standing on our own with our own individual root system, and yet underneath the surface, we're all one organism. And isn't that true for not just all of, the Front Range community or people who show up for church or synagogue, but all of humanity and maybe all of life on earth. I want to read you a bit of a poem. This is a poem called Trees by Howard Nimerov. Trees. To be a giant and keep quiet about it. To stay in one's own place and to stand for the constant presence of process and always seem the same. To be as steady as a rock and always trembling. Having the hard appearance of death with the soft, fluent nature of growth. One's being deceptively armored, one's becoming deceptively vulnerable. To be so tough and take the light so well. Freely providing forbidden knowledge of so many things about heaven and earth for which we should otherwise have no word. That last phrase might be a definition of what we call Kabbalah or Kabbalah, of the Jewish mystical tradition. Something we can't describe, providing this sort of hidden or forbidden knowledge. Okay? So which brings us to our third question. How did we get kicked out of the Garden of Eden? Raise your hand if you know. You probably heard a story about a snake and, talking to Eve, and Eve taking from the fruit of the forbidden tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so they've done some readings. It's good. Yes, and there's another tree that's named in the Garden of Eden, named in the first chapters of Genesis, the tree of life. The tree of life. You hear stories in your Sunday school about the tree of life? No. But I bet you heard about the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That got us kicked out of the Garden of Eden, right? There's also a thing, a whole church created this thing about, the sin of sexuality that got it kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Well, according to Jewish tradition, according to the sages, we were enticed out of the Garden of Eden for the sake of human evolution. And it was not a punishment. In fact, that curiosity that Eve showed, wow, that is a pretty tree. Wow, the fruit looks really good. And what's wrong with knowledge? That curiosity was celebrated. And it created an awareness of death that changed things for consciousness on earth. We can no longer live in the oblivion that it's all infinite. We are now confronted with a recognition of our finitude, the limits we have in this life. That is a kind of removal from paradise, right? If you say ignorance is bliss, knowledge is exile. But there's another tree. And actually, it's the other tree that God says, this is why we need the humans to leave the Garden of Eden. Because if they eat from that tree, they'll be like us. They will be divine beings and no longer mortal. That tree, the tree of life, is why we were asked to leave or pushed out of the Garden of Eden. The tree of life. But we know nothing about it. What is that? The tree of life, according to Jewish mysticism, is a map of God. And since you are made in the image and likeness of God, it's a map of how divine energy flows and manifests in you. In other words, it's a map back to the Garden of Eden, being who we are meant to be. And sometimes there's a gap between who we are and who we're meant to be. Well, actually, all the time. But there are two trees that are part of us. There are two aspects or layers of consciousness, layers of self, that are always a part of us. So there is the tree of life, which is infinite and pure and divine, right? This is where you say, the Christ in you. You are the Christ, right? You would say that? So we say, you're made in the image of God. You are, and in our morning prayers we say, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tehorahi. My God, this neshama, this pure life force that you placed within me, she is pure. No need to fix it. As is, perfect. That's the tree of life. And we have this, we've eaten from that fig. It's a fig tree in Jewish tradition, not an apple tree. They don't have apples actually in the Middle East. And the leaves are bigger and they covered up more of our private parts. So when we ate from that fig tree of knowledge of good and evil, we became aware of imperfection. And that planted in us a fire of being better, of improving the world, not just admiring it and trembling at its beauty as is, right? So when Moses leaves Egypt, running away because he killed the taskmaster, running away from the plight of his people, from slavery, from enslavement, when Moses leaves, he encounters the divine telling him, you need to go back and make it better. You need to go back and tell Pharaoh to let them go. It's not to let them go. We wouldn't have left on our own. We're pretty stubborn that way. To force the slaves free. You have to tell Pharaoh not just to let him go, but to send him out. How did God appear to Moses in that scene? A burning what? Okay, so it's a small tree. But this is the knowledge that slavery is wrong. And it needs to change. And that's the knowledge that comes from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the knowledge that recognizes we are in exile. We have not perfected living with one another like the aspen trees have perfected living with one another. That's the knowledge. And that's a good knowledge, even though it exiles us from a sense of, it's all good. Let's sing Kumbaya around the campfire. It's all good, right? That's the tree of life. Knows that there's something essentially pure and good about us and about the world. And a tree of knowledge of good and evil saying, and we can do better. So the Kabbalists spent centuries mapping out this tree of life to get us back to the Garden of Eden. So I have a sculpture here. So it's a little bit less tangible than a bristlecone pine. But it might look familiar to you as students of biology, genetics, physics. Anyone? Chemistry, why?
Because it's atoms and molecules are chemistry.
Okay. So there are atoms, energy centers, and pathways between those energy centers that hold them together, that create a sort of cohesion. Yes? And it also is designed to look like the double helix structure of a DNA, right? And if you're familiar with the Vedic or Hindu and Buddhist systems of the chakras, so the 7 chakras are paired in this system as well. And it's just a more detailed map of the chakras. And this maps out the flow of energy from absolutely intangible, infinite energy, or you might call quantum reality, to the physical, or you say manifestation, or embodiment of those pure, infinite, unbounded potential, right? Everything in potential, anything can be, until the physical reality that we experience, the empirical world. How does it go? It's an ancient question, right? How did the infinite become finite? That's Plato and Aristotle. And they drew on Plato and Aristotle when they mapped this out. And then how do you reverse the direction? This is the piece the Kabbalists incited. Then how do you make that finite being, you and me, community, infinite again? How do we return it to God? So that part you guys got to figure out. I just give you the... I think it starts with a reimagination of divinity, right? We need to first we can tap our psalms and the biblical poetry and one another and this incredible natural world to reimagine how we understand the infinite. Right? And we also need to so here's another piece. Why, you should have been asking this before, why would we celebrate a New Year for the trees in the middle of winter? So the answer is in the land of Israel, in Haaretz, in the olive trees. So they go dormant, right, around November. And then the leaves start to bud, February, March. But the Kabbalists realize that at this time of year, this week, the sap begins to rise in the olive trees, that there's movement, there's energy flow inside the tree that you cannot see before it manifests as leaves. So they chose this time of year to celebrate the renewal, the birth of trees, because so much of rebirth, renewal, happens outside of our vision, right? Happens inside. What's the oldest part of a tree? The core, not the roots. The tips of the roots are as young as the new growth and branches at the top. Often Judaism is presented as the roots of the tree of Christianity, right? That was either grafted or supplanted. You have this whole debate among scholars, onto. But the oldest part of the tree is the core. Whether you're the roots or the branches, you have equal access to that core. And that's what Kabbalah is highlighting for us. And that's why Kabbalah in the last 20, 30 years has been made accessible to whether you're Jewish or not. Right? The insights of that, because it's going to the core, which is, sure, it's being fed by the roots. I'm a big fan of roots and ritual. That's why I do what I do. And the movement, the core of it, is in the center, and that's the oldest part of the tree. So that's what I think we're here to access. And I think the way we turn to images of the God through the natural world, especially trees, right? This tree of life, that gets to the core, right? The molecular core, right? As well as the physical core of the tree, that we can tap and make those energies flow in new ways. And our world is desperately in need of that, of accessing that core. So we have a prayer that we say, which is exported or imported from the book of Proverbs, that is talking about chokhmah, wisdom. in the original source. And it says, she is a tree of life to them that hold fast to her. And all of her supporters are happy. And all of her pathways are peace. The rabbis took this verse to refer not to just Chokhmah, but what we call Torah. Now, Torah, the physical 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And at this time of day, when we're reading from the Torah, in the morning, after reading from the scroll, we roll up the scroll and we get ready to put it back in the ark. And we sing this melody. We sing this prayer. She is a tree of life to those who hold fast to her. And by the way, the Torah is on a scroll, and it has handles, and those handles are called trees. And so that's the image of God. And by the way, the menorah, some of you may have done a little Hanukkah, right? The original menorah is in the shape of a tree. A tree of life, a bush that burns without being consumed, without consuming itself. So you have that fire, you know what's right and what's wrong. You know you are called upon to do your part, to do what's right, but don't burn yourself out doing it. That's the message of Hanukkah. So I'm going to ask Laura to come up and offer you this song. And maybe as you listen to it, and we'll put up the English words, we're going to sing it in Hebrew. But why don't you try a tree pose while you're doing it? Up you go. So how do we get back? We reimagine God. We reach towards new roots, and we stretch our branches. May it be a tree of life. And you'll know it's a tree of life. You'll know it's divine if its pathways are pathways that lead to peace.
Etz chaim hi lamachazikim ba v'tomcheha meushar deracheha darcheno olam v'chol netivoteha shalom hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashu